as I mentioned earlier, each one of these panels begins with a question or a set of questions, and the one for our second panel is, the set of questions for our second set of panelists is, how do zoning regulations, building codes, and redevelopment pro forma impact the ability to provide affordable urban housing in American cities? And more importantly, how can architects work with planners and policy experts to simultaneously inform zoning legislation, building codes, and the general public towards the redesign of our cities to meet 21st century needs around changing family structures, transportation, and extremely importantly, racial and economic equity and climate change. So, as I mentioned before, we are giving continuing education credits, so we will continue to remind everyone of what that means and what you will learn from our panelists. It's very exciting. So our speakers on this second panel are Angie Brooks, who is the managing principal at Brooks Scarpa and the co-founder of Livable Places Incorporated. Their practice is in Santa Monica. And as you saw earlier today, they do have work here in Detroit, so that's exciting. Our second speaker will be Jonathan Tate, principal at OJT in New Orleans, and he will be followed by our own Mark Norman, who is founder of Ideas and Actions and an associate professor of practice at Taubman College. And then our respondent and moderator will be Joshua Ackers, assistant professor of geography and urban and regional studies at the University of Michigan, Dearborn, and we welcome him here to Ann Arbor. So, with that, Angie.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk about the challenges we face in the Los Angeles region and how architects are addressing them. Because in Los Angeles, you guys know NIMBYs and YIMBYs. In LA, we have what we call bananas, which is build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. And I think LA and Detroit have a few things in common, and that's not just the automobile. It's that hidden among all the challenges that we face is actually a silver lining of opportunity that I think when taken, it encourages others to follow. So I'm going to start with a film clip that is based on a nonprofit that we work with called the Skid Row Housing Trust. They build affordable housing, and a large part of our practice is actually working with nonprofits building affordable housing, because we believe that access to housing and good design is actually a right and not a privilege. And the film is actually 4 minutes long. The clip is smaller. It was the grand prize winner of the 2017 AIA Film Challenge. We've become a culture that ignores people and looks the other way. Our homeless problem, especially in Los Angeles, is so large now that it's almost untenable.
There's a lot of suffering that goes on. If you're not ready to live in the streets, it gets pretty profound.
I've known Mike for a long time, and this is really our first collaboration. The name of this project is The Six. That, in military terms, it means I've got your back. And really, Mike is the six for homeless people.
I think I was one of the first people who moved, who had keys, and I thought I was dreaming. And I came and looked, it was empty. I was like, whose house is this? They said, yours. I got a little radio, a microwave, a crock pot.
Good design is not what something looks like, but what it is like, meaning how you experience it.
Breaking stereotypes of the homeless goes back to design. It says something. It says we care about you.
Good design is part of the healing.
A little bit like Frank Sinatra, if you can do it here, you can do it anywhere.
Whatever we make here, whatever buildings we build here, they're part of the larger fabric that defines our cities.
So we currently have 60,000 unsheltered homeless people in LA County. How did we get there? Well, two things. There's a lack of supply. The LA vacancy rate is among the lowest nationally, finishing in 2017 at 3%, and that's remained unchanged since 2012. The other factor is the building process in LA has been called by some people Byzantine. Our zoning framework is from the 1940s, so basically everything you build in LA is an entitlement process. It's discretionary, and it takes about 3 years to actually get approvals for most projects that are not by right. Coupled with what I call the elephant in the room, which is low minimum wage, our poor are getting poorer. We have the working poor, where people can work 3 jobs and still be below the poverty line. In 2017, the average monthly price to rent an LA apartment was $2,300, 2/3 higher than the national average. The rent in LA eats up over 40% of the local median household income. That's typical for large metropolitan areas. So 30% of your income, if you pay more than that for housing, that's considered unaffordable. So to address what we saw as a gap between zoning, current zoning and livable communities, myself with a few other like-minded people founded a nonprofit called Livable Places, which was to both change policy and develop examples of what we considered smart growth at the time. We operated from 2000 to 2006, and we helped the city of LA do things like write ordinances to create denser neighborhoods, reduce parking, encourage a mix of uses, and among other things, we did a study for the city of Long Beach along the Blue Line, which is our transit. In LA, we put transit where we have zoned industrial because no one lives there. So no one can argue against the new transit that's going in. When we did this study, we found that 0 people were living within a quarter mile of some of the stops along the Blue Line. And we presented this report to the planning department of Long Beach, and they said our information had to be incorrect. And they said, where did you get your base information? And we said, we got it from you guys. And so they took another look at it, and they were going to spot zone one project that we were doing along Long Beach Boulevard to allow housing to be built there. And they realized that if they just rezoned the entire boulevard, it could become this mixed-use corridor. And so they rezoned Long Beach Boulevard, which gentrified the entire area and priced us out of actually buying any more property than the first parcel that we had to build affordable housing there. So a large portion of Los Angeles is still zoned industrial, where it is illegal to build housing. This building was our first project that we did with Livable Places, called the Fuller Paint Company building. We renovated the existing building that you see in yellow and added 2 floors to the roof. It was mixed use and a mixed income development for 102 condominium units. It took us 1 year and 25 zoning variances to get approval to build this here, what would be considered smart growth. It's within a bike ride of downtown LA. But it was called a demonstration project, and it had the support of a city council member. And half of what was a variance back then is now actually code in the city of LA. But today, one of the units is selling for $500,000. Today, there's no affordability in this project. But because of this project and other pioneers like that, the city is now redeveloping other areas and bringing in apartments and hotel and retail, but it's starting to become an unaffordable neighborhood. In 2000, the solution was to respond to the demographic shift of more single adults. This is in Santa Monica, called Colorado Court, and these are small studio apartments for homeless adults. And also to respond to environmental issues at the time. Sustainability, density, livability are not mutually exclusive. This project was finished almost 20 years ago, and it received $500,000 in grant money for 2 active systems, a solar array and a microturbine, and it was passively designed as a net zero building. But we had to get legislation changed to allow this project to exist here. And because some of the things that we did at the time were considered too innovative, we called it a demonstration project. And now I do that on all of my projects, because once we called it a demonstration project and said if it doesn't work, you don't have to do it again, everyone said, okay, great, go ahead and do it. So now I call everything a demonstration project. Most of what we did in this project 20 years ago is now code in the city of Santa Monica. We also know that good design helps people heal. Things like natural light and cross ventilation in all units, a mixture of open spaces, social spaces, making a home for people are what I call the mutually inclusive benefit of passive design, because it does both, right? It helps us meet our environmental goals. This is called Step Up on 5th. It's in Santa Monica as well. It's housing for previously homeless people with mental disabilities. And the program from the client was put as many units as possible on this site. So the units are about 245 square feet. They have Murphy beds that flip down out of the wall, and it was built passively. So its footprint is shaped like the letter E, which is how we used to build buildings about 100 years ago. They were called alphabet buildings. And at the time, it was a very progressive parking code, which was 1/4 of a space per unit. Now we have ordinances that allow us to build this with 0 spaces per unit as long as you're close to transit. One of the most important policies in California's history would not have happened without Arnold Schwarzenegger, who I call our governator, who was our governor from 2003 to 2011. He pushed through AB 32, which I think is going to be his legacy, and it's California's long-term approach to addressing climate change. And it's really set up as a framework to reduce emissions statewide, but it allows agencies to figure out how to do it themselves. So it started for us as architects with a series of code updates. California has met these targets in 2016, which is 4 years ahead of schedule. So we now have new state ordinances to actually get us closer to our goal. Because of AB 32, we now have high-performing, high-density housing near transit as a matter of course. This project was done with an ordinance called SB 1818, which is a state density bonus law that we have that allows us to densify projects. And LA voters in 2016 approved several ballot measures, which was by a landslide, over 70% of the voters, to fund housing and support services for the homeless. And we also voted to raise sale tax by 1/2 cent to expand public transit. So in 2015, we have something called AB 744, which reduces parking near transit and gives you more density if you build 100% affordable housing. In 2017, we have something called Measure JJJ, which is called the Transit-Oriented Communities Program, which also allows us to build denser with less parking near transit. And so because we don't have a zoning code that actually works for anybody, we have these ordinances that the state actually creates that then come down to the city, and the city creates to actually overlay on top of our inadequate zoning codes. For homeless veterans, the 6 was another passive building, which was very high performing, but it's really an example of what you can do, what architects can do when they don't have to provide all this unnecessary parking. And what I find now is that both the county and the city of LA are actually asking for innovation, which is new for me. Several RFPs were put out by the county, and we won a $1 million grant for innovative ideas on how to address homelessness in Los Angeles. And we won the grant with Plant Prefab and Community Corporation of Santa Monica. And our idea was to tailor the prefab custom home building industry to permanent and temporary supportive housing to both lower the construction cost and the time it takes to build these projects. So we created a kit of parts that can be assembled within existing zoning on any parcel, from the typical suburban lot up to larger parcels, because we realized a lot of the elements that we keep designing in affordable housing are repetitive and could be adapted to prefabrication. Because we believe that homelessness is reversible, we just need the will to do it. It's called the Nest Design Toolkit, and it can be scalable and adaptable on any combination of lots in LA County. It can be stacked on an urban lot up to 5 stories. It also works on smaller lots. And the modules range from the traditional bed type to more individualized spaces with bathrooms and kitchens. We named the different types following the nesting habits of birds. So they actually range from the blue jay, which is temporary living, to dove, which includes sleeping areas and bathrooms, is more shared living, to the osprey, where it's the most individual type, where we have typical 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, and 3 bedrooms. And every module is the same size for ease of transport and stackability. And then we're creating exterior facades that can be added depending on scale of project, neighborhood, orientation, and preference, and it's meant to be used by other developers and other architects. It allows you to tailor the look of your building as needed, and it's meant to kind of fit that what I call this sort of middle range of density in these underutilized spaces throughout LA, and it's meant to be a long-term solution to sort of fill that gap. The concept, we're using this concept on an actual project. 20% of California community college students are homeless, and a higher percentage are housing insecure and actually struggle to buy food. So this site is close to a community college and an existing temporary shelter for students. This is meant to be permanent housing for these college students who live here, and it's a big house above a church parking lot. And we're using the prefab modules for it. All the modules are actually bedrooms and study rooms. It's in an R1 single-family neighborhood, and so I'm really psyched about this project because we're densifying the R1 neighborhood. It's going to be built by right, and we're using the state ADU ordinance, which allows us to put 2 kitchens in this house, 13 bedrooms, and it houses up to 16 people. It's actually smaller than some of the new large single-family houses that are being built in Santa Monica, but it fills this critical neighborhood. And it's a very small project that I'm ending with, but I believe we need innovation at all scales and all neighborhoods. And the key for me is really to provide a flexible framework and a high-performing support system to allow architects and designers to innovate. And I think this, in turn, jumpstarts advances in standard practice. Thank you.
Let's see. Okay. Let's see if you can hear me. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for having me today. Let's see, I am an architect, actually, so in case the word's not up there, I run a small practice in New Orleans, Louisiana, and we have a fairly eclectic mix of work that we engage in. A lot of it happens to be housing, but that's not solely what we do, but mixed into what I would call as a sort of conventional normative practice, we do, in fact, try to work on a series of what I'll call self-initiated meanderings or investigations. And by that, we basically explore curiosities or themes or topics that we're encountering in the work that we're being commissioned to do, but also looking around us and trying to, again, engage in things that we think are both topical or resonate with our work or how we might be able to change the way you're looking at things, both architecturally, but even broader than that. And so I'm here to talk about one project in particular that we've been working on for several years now. It started out with, on multiple levels, but one level in particular was the notion of let's say, the absence of architecture in the realm of speculative single-family housing, right? And so this is, certainly we have an affinity for housing and residential in general as architects, but typically this is in the vein of a custom home for a private client that we work on and then produce for that one individual, but not in the realm of housing as we sort of understand it as part of the economy, right? So when we talk about housing, we talk about it as a system, we talk about it as a commodity, and it's in the abstract, but that's how it fuels the sort of world that we live in. And it's the thing that we were trying to, again, sort of engage in and understand more systematically as we began, an investigation into this as a study. This study began about 2014, where we had we were obviously coming out of or far enough away from, let's say, a powerful recession that impacted me personally, or everyone in our office, and likely everybody in this room, but certainly it colored or flavored the way we thought about housing. But it was far enough along from that initial 2008, 2009 time period that we were starting to see a swing back in the other direction, where housing pressures and the availability and affordability of housing was a tremendous issue. And so we started identifying, like, okay, what were the things that were challenging us, but also embracing and recognizing what the advantages of home ownership, single-family home ownership, was in our country. It's not for everybody, it's not the solution for everything, but it's certainly an important component of the economics of housing in America. But also looking around at what was available in this vein, and seeing things like speculative development and the real estate industry in general, and what it was doing to housing product and what was available both in our city and other cities. But also recognizing that development in general, at least at this scale, is pretty simple, and there are ways to engage in it, or there are ways to approach it that it seems, at least anyways on the surface, that fairly simple formula. Why can't we, somehow or another think about it more holistically, not just from the design side, but also understand that development in and of itself is risky business, right? Like, this is a vein that architects generally didn't involve themselves, and that developers were clients, but that wasn't the activity that we ourselves participated in. And then furthermore, like, we're well aware of and I use this movie slide as an example of the sort of fraught relationships architects have had with housing in general, and when we try to fix things, right? So as we sort of come in as a designer and we think that we have a solution to housing in some way or another, it's, we understand that that's, again, it's a sort of fraught history, but also using this as the way to say that generally as an architect, when we're asked to fix housing, if you will, it's by some way or some order the design of the house and not the system of making housing, right? And so we felt sort of removed from that in some ways. And by that I mean that we understood and believed that there was actually possibilities in the city that just weren't being explored, right? And so what we started referring to as sort of holes in the city and cracks in the market, right? So there were ways and possibilities for us to influence this and to engage in it that might not necessarily revolve, at least initially, around the design of a home, but thinking about the systems of housing. And out of this came sort of the moniker, in this case, starter home, which we gravitated towards for multiple reasons, if anything because it insinuates a sort of purpose and a role and a goal for what housing was. And again, what we thought of housing, at least in our discussions, as the ability to grow equity and as generally what we associate with the one mechanism that we can generate wealth in our lifetime, starting somewhere, and how did you enter into that system? And we did an investigation of the legacy of it. Again, like, starter housing as a greenfield development was really fascinating to us, and why it was affordable, accessible, but often located in areas that, at least in our city, didn't exist anymore, were just difficult, but weren't addressing the kind of issues that we were really interested in. And then furthermore, as a type, how it sort of harkened to, again, a lineage of housing, starting back at Levittown, if you will, going towards today about housing is sort of an evolution, and how it's changed over time, and how we've changed over time, and how that's a sort of a reflection of us as a society and what we live in. And then, so from this investigation, we, effectively sort of came up with an agenda, if you will. And this was, again, over years. This didn't pop up overnight. In fact, we're still refining this very statement. But it was, our chance to look at exactly that. I won't read it out necessarily, but there's a couple of points to sort of bring up here. Is that this is for sale housing. It's speculative, so we don't have a client. It is for, forgive me, the middle market, if you will. It's not low-income housing, it's not high-income housing, it's somewhere in between. And then it's doing all of this somehow or another without subsidization. So this is where we sort of got to, and we worked to, and it just gave us a sort of guiding, if you will, mantra as we moved into the possibility of like how you might action on this or implement this as an idea. And so what we started to do was actually look around a bit, and again, these things were happening concurrent with one another, as we would look at land, which is what we were doing here. It's trying to, okay, if we're going to do this, and if this is what it's supposed to look like, where are we going to do it? And trying to figure out what the possibilities were for vacancy in New Orleans. This is New Orleans, by the way, or Orleans Parish. What the possibilities were for vacant land and vacant land use in the city. What were the right places and the wrong places to build? Where were there opportunities that maybe we didn't notice? We went through a whole series of sort of cataloging what this land looked like, where it was, creating graphs that were, looking at proximities to downtown, so closeness to the city, basically, what were historic neighborhoods, what weren't historic neighborhoods, what the zoning designations were, and so, all very academic, right? Like we were making maps, we were making drawings, we were speculating on what, the potentials were for something like this. And, again, in that investigation, just trying to look for patterns and recognizing possibilities. And through that study, what we started to run across, quite frequently, in fact, were what New Orleans refers to as a non-conforming lot, what we colloquially call a odd lot, which are basically substandard lots throughout the city of New Orleans. And these were pieces of ground that were, basically didn't conform to what the zoning or the site area requirements were in those particular districts. A standard lot in New Orleans is about 30 by 120. These could be 15 by 30. They could be, any size. They could be 5 feet wide by 30 feet long. There were all kinds of them. And what we basically honed in on were, roughly 5,000 lots in the city that looked like development potential. And what was curious about it is that they were invisible, right? Like these lots were everywhere. You'd see them, you'd drive by them, you wouldn't think anything about them, but they weren't for sale. There wasn't a sign out. There wasn't a fence around them. Typically, they were just, in this graphic, doesn't read really well here, but they were leftover pieces from an easement or something. They were the triangular bit and in between two streets and those kind of things. So, and let me move quickly here. And this is, so we aggregated those. We started looking at what were the likelihood of us developing something like this and what would it mean if it were, say, neighborhood-wide and how we could tie all those projects together. This turned into an actually implemented project for us. So over the course of the last 4 years, we've built now 17 houses. We developed all but 2 of these. And I'm going to sort of run through these kind of quickly. The first project that we worked on, again, this was 2014, was a small house on a small lot. So we bought this, we bought the lot, we developed the house, we put it on the market, and we sold it. It's about 975 square feet. The site itself is 16 feet wide by 55 feet deep. The next project after that was actually where we had a private client come to us, and this was a self-built tiny house. So this is 183 square feet. It's the smallest permitted residence in the city of New Orleans. It still is, actually. We got a lot of flack on the first house because the press called it a tiny house, and it was 975 square feet, which is not a tiny house by tiny house standards, and so we ended up doing a tiny house for what was a homeless veteran, actually. So we helped him put this together, again, on a substandard lot. The next one was where we had a private client come to us and ask us to implement our agenda, basically. So we were sort of subverting the role of a client in this case, where they're sponsoring us to do our work, basically, which was, I think, an interesting twist on the way we worked as a practice, which is great, wonderful people. And then we worked on this one, which I like this shot because it shows you some of the context that we're working in New Orleans. And this was a 12-unit development where it's actually technically a multi-family development. It's 3 times the density of the adjoining neighborhood, what would be the standard fabric in New Orleans. In order to make this work, we had to go into basically use the condo regime as a way of generating what we wanted, which were single-family houses. So we started rewriting the condo regs in order to fit the way we wanted the housing to work, and that was individual houses that acted and operated like individual houses, but were all on a single-family lot in this case. So this is, again, a 12-unit complex that we worked on. And then the last one that we just finished is there are 2 units, 1 sold, 1 has to sell, so we're down to 1 now. Which was, again, substandard lots, 2 houses, and with each of these, and I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm running through this quickly, is we tried to sort of push on different realms of housing development and the development process. And I could sort of pick away at each of these projects to tell you what buttons we were pushing along the way. This last one was where we finally sort of delved into the sort of basic financial models of single-family housing development, where we brought in, and we were the first equity crowdfunded residential project or equity crowdfunded real estate project in the U.S. after the Jobs Act initiation of Reg CF. So these are both equity crowdfunded projects. So we have a pool of 30 or so investors that helped us with the financing on this project, and it's our way to sort of bring in community and others into the development process. But, take a breath here, the idea wasn't just to develop stuff in New Orleans, and that this we recognize is not just our problem, it's everybody's problem in a lot of ways. And so when we were initially sort of conceptualizing this project, it was meant to operate in any environment in some ways, and sort of fundamentally looking at vacancy, as this quote says, and what are the opportunities around vacancy and who might own that, and how we might leverage those conditions. And so these are just, you can't read it really, but those are just a series of slides just showing how we looked at a number of cities around the country. After some of the housing had been built, we got a little bit of press through some sort of mainstream media outlets. We had people call us from everywhere asking us to sort of implement this project in different cities, from Toronto to LA to Boston to Houston to Austin and everywhere else. I'm going to run through this kind of quick. There's a couple of projects that I wanted to talk about, Houston being one, where we actually worked with a co-developer to try to define sites in a similar way. And what we found is that, in fact, there were small lots, which, if you know Houston zoning, they were actually available because they were platted for single family, but they were also sort of tiny lots as well. So that seemed like a clean transfer of what was an original concept into another city, which wasn't the idea. Actually, is that every place is different and every place has different opportunities, and that this wasn't meant to just sort of jump from one city to the next in the same mold that it was in. And so we spent quite a bit of time, again, with a development partner trying to figure out a city that felt like it was the inverse of what we were dealing with, let's say, both in New Orleans, but also in Houston. And in this case, it was Louisville, and specifically it was in a neighborhood in Louisville called Portland. Vacancy, plenty of it, tons of open land. More importantly, the land was just about worthless, right? Like the value, we couldn't leverage property value and the sort of expense of land as a way to, and subverting that embedded expense. In other words, smaller lot is cheaper. Here, land was cheap, so we didn't have that actually working for us. You could get land anywhere. And so what we went through, and I'll sort of finish this up with this slide, was a process of trying to figure out what were the other levers that we could pull and push in order to capitalize to make a project like this, accessible and sort of meet the market requirements of that particular neighborhood. And in this case, it was all about what we said, looking beyond the lot and thinking of our site more at the block level, and recognizing who our partners were throughout the neighborhood. And in this case, it's basically a lot of land banks and a lot of nonprofits that own land. And so what we came up with, and this is the last slide, and I think I'm out of time too, is that we basically, we started to leverage those relationships and create sort of an incremental model that worked with these different landholders that were all around us as a way to sort of build up over time. We're working on this one now, and it's sort of in the early phases, and this is the next project that we'll work through. But again, I thought I would end on that. It felt applicable to what was being discussed here, certainly in Detroit and elsewhere in the country. So thank you.
Are there 100 or so more slides that I have to click through to get to? No, I'm just kidding. Was that the wrong button? Okay. Hello, everybody. So I wanted to, I hope this is not an automatic timer, but I wanted to start with a quote from Teddy Cruz. Because I think he's talking about the border wall, but we could apply it to opportunity zones. Oh, sorry. Mike? Oh, sorry. Teddy Cruz, the architect that works on the border between San Diego and, yes. I wish the former Republican presidential candidate would say things like this, but I don't think he does. But I think it applies to the housing market in a lot of cases, also to new programs that aren't necessarily crafted well. So I'm really glad to come after Maurice and the first panel and my panelists, because we're talking about strong market cities, Santa Monica, LA, weak and changing cities like Detroit, but all of them, according to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, have the same issue. Somebody making minimum wage can't find housing without being cost burdened. And that's actually a relatively new thing, that geography doesn't matter in a housing crisis. Whether you're in San Francisco or Miami or Detroit, there are tens of thousands of people that are cost burdened or housing vulnerable. I hate to start with the bad news, but I will, because I'm going to end with the good news, which is modular is not going to be much less expensive and most likely won't be a significant factor in solving the housing crisis. Passive house standards will substantially lower operating costs, but won't affect construction loan rates or the availability of pricing and financing, mostly because the lenders don't value the life cycle costs. They want to know how much it costs to build and how they're going to get taken out. Urban infill is hard to scale up and to create economies of scale because you can't increase the affordability often without going through that entitlement process that both Julie and Angie talked about. Some other bad news, which I'm actually really glad that Julie talked about and which we suffer from, and it doesn't really matter how much you lower the cost when you have this problem. In some cities, as much as 80% of the price is the price of land. That's a whole range of cities from all across the country where that's becoming a problem. Another problem, real construction costs. Global supply chains, just the inflexibility of markets, and just a lack of skilled trades. And then wage growth. So I was thinking to myself, there was a time where we weren't in a perpetual affordability crisis. And when was that, and how was it done? So apologies to my students who I talked to about this the other day. This is development in California, but it could kind of be anywhere. It's 1950. This is Lakewood. And what I want to highlight here is just the whole suite of agencies that made this possible and made this affordable. Because this is called Proformas and Protocols, I took the costs from a great book about the family that built Lakewood. This is advancing by itself, but that's probably keep me on time. So I get construction costs. I projected forward by inflation to what that would be today. But as you can see, all of this infrastructure and subsidy goes into housing we don't think is subsidized. There was a real differentiation. Nobody here thought they were subsidized, while at the same moment when public housing is being built, that's subsidized. If we project forward, and I just crossed out everyone because we know the legacy of redlining and mortgage discrimination, but this is Lakewood from the air, and then 17,000 homes built in 33 months. That's 515 homes a month and 17 homes a day. Take that, modular housing. And then in terms of construction costs, adjusted for inflation, that's $96 a square foot, $120 a square foot all in, which would be a sales price. They sold for $8,500. Today, that would be $140,000, monthly mortgage of $926. And that would be 45% of the median income in this neighborhood today, which would be deeply affordable by our affordable housing standards. So how do we, I don't know that we want this scale, but how do we deal with our crises today by looking at some of these issues? Well, we don't want to do this, for sure. We don't want to put in the racial covenants that kept many people out of those houses. Interestingly enough, a lot of people are now moving into those houses that are in our first ring suburbs. We know this issue about wealth. So not only do we have to build the housing, but we have to also try to figure out a way to increase the wealth in neighborhoods now that were built with FHA financing, mortgage insurance, et cetera, that are falling apart and in need of some love from the mortgage markets. And then there are all of those buildings that never got the mortgage insurance, right? The multifamily, the duplex, the missing middle that weren't eligible because they housed people that weren't families, they were dense for the FHA, they were too close to transit, they were too close to amenities, they weren't zoned single family. So the other interesting thing to me about this whole FHA era of housing was they scaled up because it was so lucrative and so great for homeowners that cities changed their zoning to conform to the FHA, right? And to conform to those mortgage markets. They created single-family, single-use zoning so that subdividers could actually build the housing and get it insured. That gave them 100% many times of their construction financing and gave very low interest loans to the buyers. So how do we replicate that? We probably can't, sadly. We have to do it the hard way with our 15 sources. But I think there are ways we can think about this that might scale up. And I'll show a couple of examples. But I also just wanted to show this slide because as Rasmi was talking about public housing, that direct spending line used to be where the red line was. And with each passing year, it goes down. And what you see in that red line is the kind of stealth subsidy. All the people, most of us, that don't think we're subsidized, even though we're taking a mortgage interest deduction, even though we're borrowing for 30 years and getting 5% mortgages. It doesn't just happen. It takes policy, it takes politics, it takes lobbying. So unfortunately, we have to play in those markets. We have to use the tax credits. We have to think about the tax incentives and how they work, while we also try to get agencies to do their jobs, the jobs they used to do when we built 100,000 units of public housing, for example. These are 7 categories from an exhibition I did, and I thought Lakewood used most of these. How do we use them in new projects? How do we scale up? One, I don't think we have the luxury because of climate change and just because of the density we need to make neighborhoods viable to do new construction. We need to deal with the housing we already have. A couple of things that I've written about are underwriting savings, not the value of the house. In Detroit, if a house is worth $30,000 and it needs $30,000 worth of work, you're not going to get a loan. But if that house gets $10,000 worth of energy efficiency improvements that saves $200 a month, that should be a loan. We should have programs for that. This is a program in New York State that looked at how energy inefficient homes were. Syracuse, $300 to $500 a month in the winter for heating bills, unnecessary with repairs. The home is less than the value or than the cost of the repairs. But how can we quantify what needs to be done to make that happen? Just a quick chart. And what I want to do is just say who it takes to make this happen. I would say this is scaling up, but it takes a lot. But I think the good news is we have the mechanisms to do it. So municipality, local utility, energy service company, that's the person that takes the risk, that says you will have 30% savings and guarantees that. A CRA, Community Reinvestment Act motivated bank, that doesn't necessarily lend at lower rates, but lends where banks wouldn't normally lend, and a foundation or other philanthropy focused on the issue. So in this case, where it's happened, New York City, you need the stick, ban dirty heating fuels, right? So anybody burning like heating oil of the dirtiest kind, I think it was by 2016, they had to stop. How are they going to fund those improvements? And if they do it, how can they overlay that onto making more improvements to lower the cost of utilities and ultimately make and keep affordability in their units? And so that's through grants from the Con Ed and the energy companies. And then risk sharing, so for the building owners, the person that's guaranteeing that that 30% reduction will happen will share that risk with the owner. And then the CRA motivated bank, and then foundations interested in things like climate change, affordability, and other instances. I could talk about this all day, but I have like 4 minutes. So just a couple other examples. What if we value social impact instead of maybe always just looking at the value? This case, a affordable housing development also in Syracuse, or this one's in Syracuse, formerly incarcerated people coming out of homelessness in addition to affordable units for families. People coming out of prison aren't just people coming out of prison, there are family members. So not only when they come out do they need a place to live, but they need a place to reunite with their families. So how do you do that? Local housing authority, free land, nonprofit advocacy, an organization that wants to ban the box, an organization that wants to end recidivism, an organization that is focused on the needs, the specific needs of, unfortunately, so many millions of people that are incarcerated. Community development financial institution, developer to get it built, and the foundation. So in this case, Syracuse Housing Authority gave the land, partnered with the advocacy organization, got funding from the Community Development Financial Institution, hired a third-party developer with a track record of doing this, because this was new, putting all of those different kinds of populations in the same building. And then actually the New York State courts, the Department of State, and a foundation, the Vera Institute, and the Fortune Society. So just thinking through how, I think as Angie said, like, maybe this is a demonstration, but it's great to do a demonstration because then you have the ability to scale up. Another example, we talk a lot about ADUs. We even change legislation. They don't often get built. And why is that? The homeowner has to take the risk. They're not cheap. A lot of times cities don't fully change the legislation, so you still need that extra parking spot. You still need a new water sewer hookup. But they're how our seniors can age in place. They're how younger people can have affordability in high opportunity neighborhoods. So what do? So here, municipality has to change the codes and change them in the right way. Real estate tech is actually really helpful. Socially motivated investors, because the banks aren't going to do it. If you already have a mortgage on your house and you want to build another one, that's either not going to happen if you have a mortgage, or it's a second mortgage which burdens you and puts you at risk. And then a foundation. So in this case, City of Napa, California has, as of right, accessory dwelling units, but they went beyond that and said you can also modify your house. You can put in an extra door that leads to a self-contained unit. You can put in an extra kitchen. And so doing some of those things that are cheaper than an ADU, but also allowing ADUs. New Avenue Homes has this user-friendly interface to connect homeowners to contractors and to subs that actually do this work and have a track record. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative they're focused on making housing affordable in the Bay Area, maybe out of guilt. So they didn't fund this, but they are a potential partner that one could look to get this work done. Northern California Community Loan Fund is focused on these issues. And the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, who's focused on health, has an understanding that community health leads to better physical health. I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to go through a couple and talk about maybe the good news in the midst of the bad news. Thank you.
Do we want to bring everybody up? Is that how you want to do it? Okay. Yeah, she was going to give me 5 minutes. I'll take it 5 minutes, okay? Shut me off at that time. But you guys gave me a ton to think about, and I just want to say thank you. So I think part of the reason I'm here, I run the Urban Praxis Workshop in Detroit. It's a community-driven research collective, primarily focused around property issues, and that's what we've been working on for at least the last 6 years. We developed a comprehensive database of speculation in the city, which accounts for about 25 to 30% of the housing market. We've uncovered who owns those LLCs, and then we've used that information to work directly with community groups to organize around how they want to stabilize their communities. But in talking about that, or in thinking about the kind of academic work we do, it really intersects with the three questions that all of our panelists were dealing with here today, or the three pressures that really are reshaping cities. And one is, of course, climate. Right, we're talking about this longer-term issue of climate, the immediate issue of it, and its longer-term impacts. Financialization, which is completely changing the way in which housing operates in a market, as a commodity without really much of that use value. And then finally, that wealth gap, or declining, or income inequality. All of these things make it very difficult to accomplish what it is that everyone here is pursuing. And I bring all those up because I was thinking about what Angie and Jonathan and Mark were talking about, and it's really about, with the work that they're doing, it's about creating new possibilities, right? And so what I mean by this is, like in Jonathan's case, he was talking about making the invisible visible. Right? And that is a lot of the work. A lot of the reason that we can't attack these problems systemically is that we don't always have the data, the information, or the knowledge to know what they are. And so as you go through and look at these lots, you suddenly make these visible things that you can then begin to modify neighborhoods and provide particular kinds of opportunities. Right? And in Angie's case, it's not quite the right phrasing, but it keeps us in the same place. In some ways, it makes the visible invisible. Because the work that we do with homeless populations, one of the biggest issues and insecurities they have is that their entire life is public, right? Everything that happens is in public, and it's finding those spaces and moments in which you have your own space, in which you have your own kind of privacy. And I think that speaks to a larger issue that was underlying all three presentations, was this idea of care, this idea of empathy, this idea of need, and ways in which you can get there. And then Mark does this interesting thing where he shows us what was invisible has vanished in some ways, right? When we think about all of the social supports and structures that went into subsidizing the kind of suburban growth that we saw, right? We don't often think, I mean, those of us that teach and work with us on a regular basis, we think about all of those pieces and where they've gone, but most people, even those in that red line, right, that you were showing, don't think about it in that way. And what we've seen over the last 40 or 50 years is the vanishing of those kinds of supports. But then you do this other thing that's very interesting, is that you make visible the ways in which these markets are operating today. So thinking about all of the different organizations and institutions that have to come together to make possible this kind of initiative. And being able to systemically see these in this way allows us to think about broader projects and the kinds of impacts and implications that we have. And so by being able to do that, and in all of this work, we can start to think about systemically where climate fits into that, how climate can become valued, right? We can think of positive things. Bonding agencies are now rating corporations on their climate plans, right? That's a new thing. New York City has figured out that 60 to 80% of all of their emissions come from about 25 to 30% of their building stock, and they've begun to regulate that. So as we begin to know how these systems and structures work together, we can find alternatives and ways to attack and approach them that take these grand abstract challenges and make them something that not only we can work with in our daily lives and the way that we do things, but that for those of us with students or the students here, that you can begin to see where you can directly impact and make a difference in these things. So I'll stop there, and then I'll open it up for questions. I'd like the panelists to come up, but thank you very much.
You want to throw the box?
I think the moderator is supposed to throw the box.
I'm going to throw a box. Who would like the box? Well, we got a box.
He's under the under.
Oh, good throw.
Doug Gelbaugh again. I wanted to talk about accessory dwelling units a bit, particularly to Mark. It's true that this city has foolishly turned them down. I think they're the low-hanging fruit of affordable housing. In LA, and I think Julie will confirm this, there have been about 150,000 ADUs approved. Are you aware of that? I mean, that's amazing. You were saying, Mark, they're not so promising, I thought.
It's not. I mean, so they have to get there, right? So that ordinance actually passed as a state mandate that cities couldn't block ADUs, but they did everything they could around that. And other laws had to be changed to make sure that that state mandate actually was in effect. And so if you look over time, it's like this.
Yeah.
Right, so it's a policy question. I think also in that number might be that ordinance that allowed small lot development, which is a very different thing, and there is no obligation for affordability. So I wouldn't say that it's necessary. I mean, I think it's bringing maybe different people into neighborhoods, but I don't think it's affecting the affordable housing. And what I would say is, if you're going to give somebody something, you should ask for something too, right? If I can build a 2-story, 500 or 600 unit building on my property, maybe if I rent it, it has to be rent controlled or rent stabilized, right? Ask something if you're going to give something, is all I have to say.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would like to add to that, I don't know if anybody in the planning department in the city of LA knows how many, more than maybe do, how much land area is R1 in LA, which you can only build a single family house on. So this idea that we would allow people to do something else other than a single family house on the R1 zone, to me, is huge. And I don't think ADUs are going to get us there, but I think we have to do everything. But part of it has to be looking at what the R1 zones have done to our communities. And I was quoted as saying, I think it was like a decade ago, I was in Seattle talking, and I said the single family house is going to be in the Smithsonian Institution one day because it's destroying communities. And you have to kind of look at, especially in LA, which was designed as a bunch of suburbs, in search of a city, how much space is that really taking up? And it's a lot. We know that it's a lot. In LA, we actually put our transit line right through some really low density areas, and we zoned commercial right along the transit line, but then we did a code that says if you are a C zone near an R1 zone, you have what's called a transitional height, and you can only build 25 feet. So it effectively made no one develop anything along the commercial zone, along the orange line in the valley, because it's right next to R1, and no one could connect the dots, who is responsible for actually creating zoning in LA. So those are the things that I think people need to start thinking about.
Do you think that both Minneapolis and Portland now allow 2 ADUs per unit? Essentially, just...
Well, it's not ADU. They effectively abolished single-family zoning, right? So they went to a 3-family on what was typically. So that's not an ADU. That's actual 3 units, right? So
in both those cities?
It will definitely in Minneapolis, and I know in Portland and Seattle both. Those overlays are all in place. Right. So yeah, so it's happening. I mean, all that's happening.
Well, that's a big deal. It seems like.
Yeah, no, it's a huge change. In fact, I should say, like, part of the or what initiated the work was recognizing that a great deal of our city was single-family housing. So, like, what are the things we can do? And what I didn't say in the conversation is, like, we're proponents of, as of right, like, avoiding the mind-numbing, process that we all go through to try to get something done in the years and years and years in which it takes to happen. It's like, okay, this is what we have. What do we make out of it, right? So, but that's changing. In fact, our work was specifically demonstration work, again, to use your term, I think is very effective in this case. It wasn't like we were solving the problem, we were just showing what the possibilities were, and that they are now rewriting, at least New Orleans is now rewriting their housing, all their housing regulations, and they're using some of our work and others in the city as examples about what they can do.
To allow people to do that, yeah.
Hi there, thank you. My name is Aloka Narayanan. I'm a student in the MPP program here at U of M. In light of the recent passes of legislation in California, including statewide rent control, I'm wondering how you think that'll impact development moving forward.
How that'll impact affordability, or I didn't hear it, sorry.
Yeah, so for affordability and like I guess the pull to develop moving forward.
I don't think it's going to, Julie can jump into, I don't think it's going to do much, but I think it's something that had to be done because it's out of control completely. And I think it was, if I remember, it's 5% per year for 10 years for new construction.
On top of overinflation.
Yeah, which, okay, that'll prohibit craziness, I guess. But, it doesn't help any of the existing housing that's there now. It doesn't help any of the existing zoning. It's just probably putting a Band-Aid on a bigger issue.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone for coming, but my question is for Jonathan. I always wonder why so few firms dip into development, and I think, of course, there's risk aversion and not knowing how to build a pro forma, or just a lack of knowledge increases the risk even more. But also I was wondering, I thought maybe development seems to be a full-time job and being an architect seems to be a full job. So I'm wondering, within your firm at the scale you're doing, does the development take away from the design, or do you maybe save time because you don't have to meet with clients and negotiate the design every week? Kind of wondering how your firm is structured.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking it. In fact, I usually, if I weren't rushing through that, I have a very emphatic, like, we are not developers, right? Like, the goal of our doing this work wasn't to establish a new business model whereby we could develop our own work and then restructure a firm accordingly. So it's, having said that, we're actually outside of the housing, which I said we had one left to go. We have multiple other development projects that we sort of run into that address housing, but in different ways, using other sort of substructures to try to support or at least engage the topic. In this case, the answer is like we fit it in the workflow of the office, but it's often the thing that you do when you've got a spare minute to spend on it. And so there was early on, there was we weren't as busy as we are these days, and we spent quite a bit of time just working through it. It was all at risk, right? Like nobody was paying us to do this work. There was no guarantee that all the effort that we put into it was going to turn into anything, frankly. But but fortunately, we were able to sort of build off of that and turn it into a process which, to answer your question more directly, is like we're not organized in a way that supports or allows for development in general, right? Like we're a conventional architectural office, and we just sort of squeeze it in. It's kind of a pathetic response in some ways, if you'll forgive me. It's just I wish I had a better answer, but I don't really know the model, and furthermore, we're not trying to create that model, so we don't really put any energy into it, and we just squeeze these things in, and we treat them like a real project. It just so happens that we're the ones doing it. And we have partners. It's not just us. We have people that work with us on that are, they handle certain sides of it. The last 2 houses were solely us. There was nobody else involved. We worked through those, but some of the other projects we do have partners, and so consequently we have people we have to work with. But we also have partners that as an owner, we don't generally, as an architect, we don't generally interface with, but as an owner, you more directly interface with. So financially speaking, we have banks, we have attorneys, we have so on that we have to work with that sort of keep us on track. But then also we have a real estate agent and industry that we're trying to engage with and work with. So there's a lot of interface going on. So the notion that you can develop and block the rest of the world out, it doesn't work that way. So.
Thanks.
Okay. My question is for Angie and perhaps for Mark as well. And I'm a great admirer of the work that Brooks and Scarpa have done for the Skid Row Housing Trust. I mean, it's just amazing. And one thing that's just so mysterious to me about it is just what is this Skid Row Housing Trust? In other words, what organization could possibly afford to do that quality of work for the population that is the worst served otherwise? And is this a model, or is this some kind of one-off thing that can never be repeated?
So good design doesn't necessarily cost more money. That's the first thing. And the Skid Row Housing Trust is a nonprofit that's been operating for over 30 years. And it was started by Mike Alvidrez, who actually went to UCLA as an urban planner, I think. And so I've known him for a long time, and Julie's known him for a long time. And he believes that design actually helps the lives of the people who live in his buildings. And so he hires architects that he knows can give him quality design, and maybe something that he didn't think he would get, new innovative ideas. But they're a traditional private nonprofit, like other private nonprofits that we work with. But I would say that they're different in that they actually care about the people, they really care about the people who live in their buildings. And they have used this housing first model for a long time, which is that you take people off the street and provide them with housing, and then you help them solve their problems. You don't say, I've built some affordable housing, I want you guys now to come and live here, but you have to have good credit, you can't be on drugs, you have to meet all these other things. So the housing first model takes people off the street and then it's permanent supportive housing, and so they've been doing that for a long time. And with the design of the project that I showed called The Six, they actually have formed a building committee made up of people who live in their projects who were previously homeless. And so the building committee is people who were homeless. And so they come to the design from a point of living on the streets. And our design was actually slightly different, where we had a courtyard with this monumental stair that physically connected the building to the street. And they said that they had lived on the street, and the street's not a safe place to be, and they didn't want to be physically connected to it anymore. They wanted to be more private, but they still wanted to be connected. So at that point, we changed the design so that the way you actually circulate and enter the building is different than what we had before. And you then are able to exist in an exterior courtyard that's visually connected to the street, but physically separate from the street. So the process I've found in designing and developing with them is completely different than some of the other nonprofits that we work with, but it starts with the leadership of the Skid Row Housing Trust, who was this one person who retired last year. And the movie, actually, the film was specifically about him and his legacy with the Skid Row Housing Trust. And he started on Skid Row, and our project for him, called The Six, was their first building off of Skid Row in an adjacent neighborhood, because he's now priced out of Skid Row in LA.
And I'll just, to further unpack the mystery, that was actually my first job. I was working at Skid Row Housing Trust while I was still in planning school. And my projects are never up on the screen because Skid Row Housing Trust initially was an Episcopalian nun who saw the problem. Skid Row, the area, the 1 square mile area, had 60 single-room occupancy hotels owned by slumlords. And so the mission was get those 60 hotels out of the hands of slumlords and make them housing secure for the people that live in them, who were paying by the night and had to get kicked. They got kicked out on the 29th because if they stayed through the 30th, they would be considered residents. So they were on the street one day or 2 days or a weekend and then back in. Anyway, so they actually got all 60, Skid Row Housing Trust and another nonprofit, out of the hands of the slumlords, and had the track record to start building new buildings. But if you look, I mean, some of the early buildings were 10 units in 1890s, small buildings with ground floor commercial. Some are rehabs of sort of larger hotels. But it really is a range. And so to me, it's almost more amazing that they're doing these historic rehabs, rehabs of buildings that the city had taken from slumlords, and also spectacular new construction with amazing architects.
Oh, gosh.
Oh.
Oh, my God.
This is to show you how old I am. We did the first new Skid Row Housing Trust project that was built in LA. They had not built what they called an SRO at that time in over 35 years. And funding through, I don't know exactly how we did it, but it was the first new build there. And I guess, and the lady...
Candy.
Well, whoever was there then, my mind is gone, but...
Candy Rupp gets
no,
it down.
well, Candy, before Candy, there's also
Alice.
the lady on the board. So
Alice
anyway,
Callahan, yeah.
Sorry, this is getting to be
Sister
like
Alice.
gossip in LA time. But the interesting part was Alice Callahan is who you're thinking of. So Alice Callahan was of the opinion that if you make something beautiful and you clean it, you basically suggest a level of care that was very important. So this was one of the sort of starting principles I remember. That affordable housing was won an AIA National Award back in '91 or something like that. And since then, you're right, there's a phenomena there because they have done some extraordinary projects with some extraordinary architects, every couple of years since then. So it is a weird magic place.
You have to throw the microphone, Julie.
I'm not throwing it, you're nuts.
Hi, I have a question about partnerships. So I think a few folks touched on this in a few of the discussions, but one of the sort of emerging trends is these health and housing partnerships. So we're seeing hospitals and healthcare agencies investing more in housing. For hospitals, it's, a matter of, it costs less to house someone than to constantly have repeated emergency room visits. So are there other institutions, organizations, sort of non-traditional entities you would imagine might begin investing in housing or actually getting into the business of developing housing? Do we see universities who already develop some type of housing moving into the development of affordable housing? So just any thoughts about innovative partnerships that might emerge out of this new era of innovative partnerships?
I can start. It's not the best answer, but I know that some of the charter schools in Los Angeles are thinking about building housing with the school. And LAUSD, I think, is also thinking about housing with schools, because one of the things that is happening in Los Angeles is that teachers can't afford to live anywhere near the schools within which they teach. They commute 2 hours away. So they're starting to talk about it, but I don't know of any great examples at this point.
I mean, I think for me, anybody that owns land is a good partner.
Yeah.
And so hospitals typically own a lot of land. Municipalities have land and parking lots. A lot of people are looking to churches with declining congregations, but that might own land. So I think usually I hate to make it sound transactional, but a lot of times it's land, and it's also, when I've seen it happen with universities, a lot of times it goes wrong. My friends at Columbia can back me up on this. Because you have to have an anchor institution that's also not self-interested in their own needs. And so, I think hospitals have that motivation like you talk about. And churches as well, because they're already doing a lot of charitable work. But I think also one interesting thing about California is maybe there's another state now, but they were the first to institute cap and trade for carbon emissions. And so inadvertently, the utility companies and big polluters fund affordable housing, because the funds from the California's cap and trade program go into an affordable housing fund. So sometimes it's better that people don't know, right? Like that they're part of a
corporate welfare.
Yeah, like the policy, right? I'd much rather have a blanket policy or housing as of right than have to beg Mark Zuckerberg to fund housing near the Facebook campus. But rather have the state say, right, if you're building 2 million square feet for 20,000 employees, maybe you should think about the quality and opportunities of people in the neighborhood.
One of the things that we are seeing in Los Angeles is the Department of Transportation and MTA teaming with the housing department in the city of LA to build housing with private nonprofits. So one project in particular is in Venice, and it's a parking lot that is owned by DOT, and the nonprofit developers coming in and building affordable housing, they have to pay to park the same number of cars inside their building, but they get the land. So they take what is now a big, huge empty parking lot, they're gonna squeeze the cars into the middle and then do a ring of housing around it. So it's gonna actually be better for the neighborhood, densifies the neighborhood. It's 2 stories above 1 story of art spaces and retail, but it's owned by the transportation folks. So that's a good partnership that I've seen happening in LA.
And I'd say we encounter similar things, and just to sort of second the 2 responses here, and to add one more example is actually we're working on a prototype for post-incarceration housing that actually uses sheriff land, land that's owned by the sheriff department basically, and through a long-term lease arm we're able to put housing on that site that's specifically for transitional housing from long-term incarceration, and that's coupled with a nonprofit who deals with transitional support systems, right?
And then the project that I showed with the solar panels on it was actually, when you said partnership, I'm like, I don't know of any partnerships, and now I'm thinking of all these partnerships. The land was owned by the city of Santa Monica, and they gave the Community Corporation of Santa Monica a long-term lease for $1 a year, and so they developed that project without paying for the land.
Thank you. Those are great examples. This makes me really nervous. Okay.
So I guess it's a question for Josh, actually, whether...
I was expecting a question.
Oh, no. Which has to do with whether what aspects of this work do you think, and maybe a little bit of Mark as well, is translatable within the speculative market of Detroit?
Finding partnerships to build quality housing for people on the margins is probably the most impactful, right? A lot of we just recently finished a report for Poverty Solutions, right? So not only are houses owned by large-scale landlords being bought cheaply in auctions and not being repaired, but these houses themselves are toxic. They were primarily built before 1979. They have increasing lead hazards. We find kids under 6 are 1.8 times more likely to have lead poisoning if they're in a house or owned by a landlord with 10 properties that bought out of tax foreclosure, right? So it's not just the shortage of quality or the shortage of housing that's there in the city, particularly for low-income people, but it's also the quality of housing that's there. And more broadly, the way that landholding has changed after the financial crisis means that eviction is baked in to a lot of these contracts. And so, we'll see people consistently in groups I work with, very short tenures at multiple houses on the idea that they're going to buy it. And so being able to develop these partnerships, being able to identify, there's a large amount of vacancy, as Maurice is well aware of, right? But being able to identify those lots and ways, as you were talking about in Louisville, right? When you can't leverage the cost of the land to begin to build something that would supplement what currently exists. And so all of those pieces are there. Mark does a great job of kind of building out the complexity of the relationships to make some of these projects happen. It's finding the right partners in the city, and there are a number of them in the room today, and there are a number of people working very hard on those issues now.
I've got this.
I'm terrible at catching, so I'm really glad you. So thank you very much for this conversation. I want to touch back on something that Mark you presented in your slides, which is racial disparity in household wealth, and touch on the sort of the traditional argument for home ownership being that it's a vehicle for wealth accumulation for families. And I just wanted to ask the panelists if you could respond to the, what is your feeling about the continued significance of the ownership of housing, having an ownership stake in housing as a way of helping families to build wealth and homeowners to build wealth and so forth?
I'm so conflicted about that because I think it's the solution and the problem. I don't think our houses should be our piggy banks. I think it's much better if you actually have like a living wage and you can have savings and invest or start a business. I think that's a much healthier way rather than putting everything in your house, which leads to speculation, which leads to a need to, not ever change single-family zoning because that's what makes the piggy bank work, right? Like, I buy low, I sell high to somebody else, who then sells high to somebody else. So in my perfect world, housing wouldn't be our retirement plan, our insurance policy. It would be something else. But one thing specific to Detroit, to answer Sharon's question, that distresses me, I'm relatively new to the Detroit context, is you see so many people paying rents that are like the equivalent of double or triple what the mortgage would be. And that's kind of that, unfortunately, FHA problem. If you can get a 30-year mortgage for 4% interest, like, there ain't nothing better than that. And so that's actually also part of the problem, is that we're subsidizing all that. So, that's a subsidized, right? That depends on the federal government ensuring it, and in a crisis, 2008, 2009, bailing out the people that made the bad loans. So I don't know how to answer your question.
I mean, and I can certainly follow up to that, given that we've spent a fair amount of time thinking about all this, and to say as well that certainly conflicted by it. I know, if I didn't state already, like what the shortcomings are of that, and for us, like fundamentally, like if you were just to acknowledge it as a resource and a tool, and we at least, more optimistically thought of it as a way that gave people freedom so that you could reinvest that money in something that you believed in, and so, it wasn't just something you sat on for your life, but you were able to sort of turn it, which, has its own problems, as Mark's talked about. The thing that we got concerned about fundamentally, though, was like that, who had access to that, right? And what we were seeing around us was that no one, ourselves included, had access to that as a possibility anymore. And so we were, in our own way, just trying to make sure that that was still a tool or a possibility for people. And that was the thing that kind of fundamentally sort of underwrote what we were investigating, at least from the outset. So, but likewise conflicted, and we've played around with other ways of distributing, the profits off of that through co-ops and land banks and everything else, and just haven't, we're still scratching around with that, I have to say. And in fact, that's our next objective, which we didn't talk about here, and we haven't really publicized in any significant way, but looking at cooperative ownership models that sort of piggyback off of business strategies or economic development programs as a way to sort of support some ownership model and therefore the equity benefits of that. So, but I don't know, it's tough.
Yeah, I would add that I just think there needs to be new models of shared equity. And I think in New York you have that. And it's weird that I'm hearing myself say this because I don't support HOAs. But in this country we have, you have a single family house, or you live in an apartment, or you live in a condo, and it's like, 3 choices. And you go to Europe, and there's 25 different choices or ways to live. So I think in this country, we have to get away from this idea that the single-family house is this golden opportunity, and realize that for a long time, we've been subsidizing luxury housing in this country, and we need to stop doing that. So just to innovate with new models is what we need to do, and we can look to other countries to start doing that, I think.
So I think this is a good moment to stop. I want to remind everyone of a couple of things. First, we will reconvene at 1:45, but in the interim, there is lunch downstairs in room 1360 for our attendees. There's also an exhibition down in that room of a very small portion, but some of the work that has been conducted by our studios over the past 3 years. So I invite everyone down for lunch to view some of that work and to reconvene in here at 1:45.